The galaxy had learned to sleep without fear of humanity. For almost 100 years, the Council told stories about the fall of the Terran race, how their fleets had burned, how their world had turned to ash. It became a lesson for others, a warning of what happens when a small world dares to challenge the great empires. Over time, the name became nothing but a cold legend. Young cadets in military schools learned about them like children learned ghost stories. But in the empty corners of space, far beyond the border charts, something old was waking. It began with a signal, weak, distant and broken by static. Patrol stations marked it as background noise, nothing important. But then it came again, clearer, heavier, like a heartbeat in the dark. One outpost after another picked it up, and the tone was always the same. Steady, exact, not natural. Commanders argued it was a glitch. Scientists said it was a dying satellite. But the older officers, the ones who still remembered the war, fell silent when they heard it. Because the signal pattern was Terran. In a hidden chamber inside the Galactic Council, the highest rulers watched the signal rise across their star maps. It was too perfect to be random. Someone or something was moving through the void, slow, careful, and organized. No message followed, no face. Just the pulse of power returning from the shadows. Ships were sent to investigate, but they vanished without a trace. Patrol fleets were deployed, but their last messages were only static and the sound of metal tearing in the dark. It was as if the night itself was eating them. Whispers began to spread through the colonies. Miners on distant moons swore they saw giant black shapes moving between stars. A merchant convoy near the edge of Sector 9 disappeared completely. And then the first image leaked. It was blurry, almost broken, but clear enough to freeze every system official who saw it. The image showed the outline of a warship, massive, scarred and silent. Not alien, human. The Council called an emergency meeting. Holograms of powerful leaders filled the great chamber, their faces pale and tight. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. Humanity was supposed to be extinct. Their fleets were supposed to be destroyed. No ship should have survived the last war, but something had. Something was coming back. While the Council argued, the stars themselves began to change. Deep sensors detected hundreds of silent contacts moving in formation through uncharted space. Their path was clear. They were heading toward the core worlds. Every ship's engine was cold. Every system was silent. It was as if they were ghosts, moving without broadcasting, without light, without fear. Panic grew. This was not a lost ship drifting in space. This was a fleet. On one outer world, a lonely watch station picked up the first clear reading. The officer on duty stood frozen as the dark shapes passed across the star field. He tried to hail them, but no answer came. Then the lights in his station flickered. All systems went dark. Through the reinforced glass, he saw a ship so large it covered half the sky. Its surface was blackened and full of scars, its design old but deadly. It moved like a predator. A moment later, his station vanished from the network forever. Back in the council chamber, the fear finally broke through the pride. Generals shouted for fleets to be moved. Politicians demanded a message be sent. But what message do you send to ghosts? One old admiral stood and whispered, "They're back." The room fell silent. Everyone knew who he meant. The Terrans had once been known for their silence before war. They never warned, never explained, never begged. They acted, and the signal pulsing through the void was not a cry for peace. It was a warning, a reminder that the forgotten do not stay forgotten forever. Civilian worlds started to panic. Old war shelters were reopened. News feeds filled with old footage of the Terran War, burning fleets, broken stations, the last transmissions from Earth. Many believed it was impossible. Many thought it was just fear playing tricks. But then the stars betrayed the truth. Hundreds of warships appeared on deep space scanners, arranged like a blade being drawn from its sheath. They were coming, slowly, silently, with no flags and no mercy. The galaxy had told itself the story of humanity's extinction for almost a century. But the void had kept its secret. The Terrans had not died. They had waited. And now, the night sky was about to remember their name. The Galactic Council's chamber was in chaos. The echo of the Terran signal had spread like wildfire through every sector, and now the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat around a massive circular table, faces pale, voices sharp. Generals, diplomats, and rulers shouted over one another, demanding answers that no one could give. The air itself felt heavy, as if the silence coming from the void was pressing down on them. They had built their power on the belief that humanity was gone. Now that belief was cracking. One of the defense ministers slammed his hands against the glowing table. "It's a trick," he barked, his voice trembling. "Someone wants us to believe they're back." But his words fell flat because everyone had seen the same reports. Entire patrol fleets had disappeared without distress calls. Border worlds had gone dark one after another. No empire had the kind of power to silence entire sectors like that. Only one enemy in history had ever done it: the Terrans. The Supreme Speaker of the Council tried to calm the storm, but even his words carried fear. "We need confirmation," he said slowly. "We can't act on ghosts." A cold laugh came from one of the older admirals. His uniform bore scars from the last war. "Ghosts don't leave sensor signatures. Ghosts don't fly in formation. That's not a trick. That's a fleet." The room fell silent. Everyone knew he was right. In the military command network, transmissions poured in like a flood. Border defense lines were failing without a single shot fired. Black silhouettes of warships were captured for seconds before the cameras died. No demands, no communication, only silence and movement. Their paths were clear. They were heading straight for the heart of the galaxy. Panic spread through civilian channels. People whispered the old name again, a name that had been buried for generations: humanity. The Council voted to send out a diplomatic fleet. But before the message even reached the edge of the system, the Terran fleet shifted course, as if they already knew. One by one, their ships began to appear on the outer edge of the Council's territory. Dreadnoughts, carriers, ships with designs that matched old war records, but larger, sharper, deadlier. They were not survivors, they were hunters. Inside the chamber, one of the councillors whispered, "What if they never died?" No one answered, because deep down, everyone already knew. The Terrans had not been destroyed. They had retreated into the shadows, into places no one dared to follow. And now they had returned, not with words, but with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Emergency defense fleets were scrambled, but the captains hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to face the Terrans again. Memories of the old war ran too deep. Entire empires had burned the last time they tried to stop them. Those who fought humanity once still carried the scars in their history, and those who had never seen it with their own eyes could feel the fear like a pulse in their bones. The Council tried to send an open message to the fleet, a call for peace, or at least an explanation. No reply came. The signal was received, recorded, and ignored. The Terrans were listening, but they didn't care to answer. Their silence said more than words ever could. They weren't here to talk. They were here to remind the galaxy of what it had done. On a far moon, a young officer watched as the black shapes filled the sky. His hand shook as he whispered, "They're real." Across 1,000 worlds, leaders understood that the old nightmare had returned. The galaxy had lived too long believing in a lie. They had buried humanity like a story to be forgotten. But humanity had not forgotten them. And somewhere, deep in the command bridge of a massive Terran flagship, a single figure stood watching the stars. No words, no orders. Only cold eyes locked on the center of the galaxy. The Council thought they had erased a race. They had only given it time to grow stronger. The void had shaped them, and now it was bringing them home. The first Terran ship appeared above a border world without a sound. No warning, no flash of arrival, no signal. One moment the sky was empty, and the next it was filled with darkness. The warship was massive, larger than any ship built in the last century, its black hull carrying the scars of ancient battles. It floated above the planet like a shadow cast by something far greater. People stared up from the surface, frozen in disbelief. Soldiers who had trained their whole lives to fight foreign invaders couldn't move. The stories they grew up hearing were real. Humanity had returned. The planet's defense systems came alive in panic. Sirens screamed across the cities. Fighters scrambled into the sky. Anti-orbital cannons charged. But even as they aimed, the Terran ship didn't move. It simply hovered there, silent and still, like a predator watching prey that didn't even know how close it was to being devoured. Then, without any transmission, without any sound, more signatures appeared on the scanners. 1, 5, 20, 100. Black ships emerged from the void around the planet in perfect formation, moving as if they shared one heartbeat. Inside the planetary command center, officers shouted orders over one another. Targeting systems locked. But none of the Terran ships powered weapons. No shields raised. No threats made. It was as if they were daring the defenders to make the first move. Fear crept into the room like smoke. Everyone remembered what the old record said. Humanity didn't speak before war. Across the planet, civilians flooded the streets, staring at the massive black shapes blotting out the stars. Parents held their children tightly, as if hugging them could keep the sky from falling. Old veterans, the last few who had survived the Terran War decades ago, fell silent. They recognized those hull designs, those sharp lines built for war and nothing else. They had seen what followed ships like these. A trembling voice from the Defense Command opened a channel. Unidentified fleet, state your purpose. The message echoed into the void. Seconds passed. Then minutes, no reply. Just the deep hum of engines older than most civilizations. Finally, a single transmission cut through the static. A calm, cold human voice said 4 words that froze every heart on that planet. We never died. We waited. Panic exploded. Some defense fleets powered their weapons, but their captains hesitated. Everyone knew that if humanity had returned with such force, resistance would be useless. The old stories spoke of their unmatched precision, their brutal efficiency, and their silence before striking. And what terrified the defenders most was not the number of ships, it was their stillness. Only those who were absolutely sure of victory stood so calm. High above the surface, the Terran ships began to shift, spreading out in wide arcs, surrounding the planet like wolves closing in on prey. But they didn't fire. They didn't even demand surrender. They just watched. One of the ships passed close to an orbital station, its black hull covered in strange glowing symbols, marks of a civilization that had grown far away from the galaxy's light. No one could read the symbols, but they felt the message in their bones. In the council chamber far away, live feeds from the border world sent shockwaves through the ruling elites. The images showed warships that should not exist. The Council's fleets were advanced, but they were nothing compared to this display of quiet power. Every Terran ship moved in perfect unity, like a blade sliding through water. No wasted motion, no weakness. Some councillors shouted to send fleets, others begged for peace. But the truth hung in the air like ice. If the Terrans wanted war, that border world would already be gone. They were sending a message: we are here, we remember. And they wanted the entire galaxy to hear it. As night fell on the border world, the stars were no longer visible. They were hidden behind the black hulls of Terran ships. For the first time in 100 years, the galaxy realized something it had forgotten. The Terrans did not beg, they did not warn, and they did not forgive. They waited until their enemies grew weak, and then they returned from the void. The galaxy had long buried the story of how humanity vanished. They spoke of a great war, of Terran arrogance, and how they burned themselves out. But the truth was never told. When the Terrans sent out their final distress calls, begging for help as their colonies fell and their fleets broke apart, the Galactic Council didn't answer. They turned off their channels. They sealed their gates. They erased their guilt by writing a new history where humanity had simply disappeared. Now that history was bleeding back into reality, deep in the archives, old recordings were played again, transmissions filled with human voices screaming for aid, begging for evacuation, promising to remember who left them to die. The Council had locked those files away, but now they had no choice but to face them, because the ones they abandoned were returning. And they were not weak anymore. A secret session was held inside the council tower, hidden from the public. Only the highest-ranking leaders were present. Around the room, faces once proud were now pale with fear. "We made a mistake," one minister whispered. But another snapped back, "No, we made a choice. And now we'll pay for it," no one argued. They all knew the truth. They had built their empires in the silence left by humanity's fall. They had grown rich and powerful by taking what humans left behind. The Terran colonies had been some of the most advanced in their time. When the Council abandoned them, they thought the humans would crumble and die in the dark. But humans were never known to die quietly. Instead, they vanished beyond the maps, into the unknown regions no one dared to enter. No one saw what they became in the shadows. And that was what terrified the Council now. On every major network, people began to question the official story. Old veterans spoke on hidden channels about what they had witnessed during the last war. They remembered the black ships, the iron discipline, the way Terrans fought like a storm with no mercy. They remembered how the Council closed its gates while Earth burned. The truth spread like fire. Fear spread with it. Meanwhile, the Terran fleet drew closer to the core. They still hadn't fired a single shot. Their silence was louder than any war cry. It was not the rage of a wild enemy. It was the calm of a power that knew exactly what it was doing. It was revenge carried with patience. The Council tried to cover up their past betrayal, but the Terrans were already making sure the galaxy remembered. Across the stars, old wrecks of Terran stations lit up for the first time in decades, transmitting recordings of their last hours. The cries of dying colonies echoed across star systems. The galaxy couldn't turn away anymore. It was too late. The past was no longer buried. In the council chamber, the Supreme Speaker whispered, "We thought they were finished." But an old admiral stared at the star map, watching the fleet formations move like a blade cutting through the dark. "No," he said, "we only gave them a reason to return." Every ship in the Terran fleet carried the memory of that betrayal. Every captain had been raised in the shadow of what the Council did. They had not come back for peace. They had come back for justice. The kind of justice only silence and steel could deliver. The galaxy had buried the truth. Humanity had built an empire on it. And now it was time for the galaxy to face what it had tried to forget. Panic spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The Terran fleet didn't need to attack. Their silent march alone was enough to break the fragile balance the Council had built. Empires that once stood tall began to crack. Trade routes collapsed overnight as merchant convoys refused to fly through systems where Terran signatures were detected. Border worlds surrendered before a single ship even reached them. People didn't wait for orders anymore. They packed their lives into transports and fled. It wasn't war. It was fear. On the bridge of a frontier patrol station, an officer stared at the scanners in disbelief. Hundreds of Terran ships were approaching, moving in perfect formation, their engines cold and quiet. No warnings, no declarations. The officer's voice shook as he whispered, "They don't even need to shoot." Around him, trained soldiers, men and women who had never known real war, watched with wide, helpless eyes. Generations had grown up believing humanity was a ghost from the past. Now the ghost had returned with steel in its hands. Inside the council chamber, the walls trembled with arguments. "We need to fight," shouted one admiral, slamming his fist on the table. "No," another snapped. "You don't fight something like that. You survive it." Reports poured in from every system. Entire defense fleets had gone dark. Governors of key sectors were abandoning their posts, surrendering without a single order. The Terrans hadn't fired a single shot, yet worlds were falling. Fear was doing the work for them. On a distant colony, the night sky was filled with black hulls, blotting out the stars. Thousands of people gathered in silence as the first Terran dreadnought passed overhead. It made no sound. It didn't need to. The colony's governor stepped out onto the balcony, looked up, and simply lowered his flag. There was no point resisting. Everyone knew what humanity could do when pushed. The last war had been brutal, and that was when humanity had been desperate. Now they were prepared. Old powers that once mocked humanity began turning on each other. Alliances fractured as empires fought to save themselves. Some begged the Council for protection, but the Council could barely protect its own core worlds. Fleets scrambled in panic, trying to form a defensive line, but they all knew what was waiting beyond the stars. The Terran fleet moved like a storm, calm, controlled, inevitable. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the civilian networks. They said the Terrans had built something in the void, something far beyond what anyone in the galaxy could match. They said their technology had evolved in isolation, shaped by rage and memory. Every rumor added fuel to the fear. Empires that had once ruled over dozens of systems began collapsing from the inside. Soldiers deserted. Leaders fled. The galaxy that once felt untouchable now trembled like a child in the dark. On the Terran flagship, the command deck was silent. Dozens of officers moved like shadows, their eyes fixed on the stars ahead. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. They had waited 100 years for this moment, and they didn't need noise to mark their return. Their silence was enough to break empires. The Council finally understood the truth too late. Their power had been built on a lie that humanity was gone forever. And now that the lie was breaking, everything they built was crumbling with it. The Terrans didn't have to invade every world. The galaxy itself was collapsing under its own fear. All the humans had to do was keep moving forward. One world at a time, one fleet at a time, like the void itself was swallowing the stars. In the council chamber, the silence was heavier than any alarm. Every leader, every admiral, every diplomat could feel it, the weight of a power they had tried to erase. And then the silence shattered as the Terran flagship finally spoke. All across the galaxy, on every major channel, screens flickered. Civilian feeds, military networks, even hidden encrypted lines, they all went black. A single transmission overrode everything. A human face appeared. The figure stood tall, dressed in a dark uniform that carried no flag, no crest, only the cold, sharp edges of a power that no longer needed symbols. His eyes were hard like steel, calm and steady, as if he carried a storm behind that silence. When he spoke, his voice echoed through every world, every ship, every station. "We gave you mercy once. You answered with silence. Now the void remembers what you chose to forget." People across the galaxy froze. Generals stopped barking orders. Civilians fell silent in crowded streets. The council members shifted in their seats, their hands trembling, as if the very air had turned colder. The Terrans didn't threaten. They didn't scream. They didn't demand. Their words were like a knife, calm, quiet, and deadly sharp. The transmission continued. "You called us extinct. You told your people we were broken. But extinction is mercy. We were not given mercy. We were left to bleed in the dark. And in the dark, we learned to become something more." The voice was steady, but beneath it there was a rage that time had not washed away. "We built an empire where none dared to go. We watched your worlds grow fat on our graves. And now the stars will remember us." Every ship in the Terran fleet activated their lights at once, and across the void, thousands of glowing lines drew the outline of a formation unlike anything seen before, a living wall of steel and fire stretching across the edge of Council space. Even the largest Council fleets looked small next to it. Panic swept through the command networks. There was no hiding the scale of it anymore. Humanity hadn't returned with remnants. They had returned with an empire. On border worlds, soldiers dropped their weapons. Some cried. Others whispered prayers they hadn't said since they were children. The old fear had returned, not as a story this time, but as a reality hanging over their heads like a sword. Civilian ships clogged escape routes, trying to flee deeper into the core. But deep down, everyone knew there was nowhere to run. Inside the council, arguments died. For the first time in a century, the powerful rulers who once mocked humanity sat in silence. They had spent generations pretending their betrayal was justified. But betrayal always leaves a scar, and the Terrans had carved their pain into the stars. A few desperate voices tried to suggest peace talks, but no one listened. The Terrans had not come to talk. They had come to be heard. The human figure on the transmission leaned closer. His final words cut through the galaxy like thunder in an empty hall. "We are not your ghosts. We are your consequence." Then the transmission ended. In that moment, the galaxy realized something terrible. The Terrans didn't just want to return. They wanted the galaxy to remember every second of its silence. And now, no world, no fleet, no throne would escape the weight of that memory. The warships that once were myths had spoken, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. The Terran fleet moved through the stars like a storm, with no sound. Entire systems dimmed under their shadow. One by one, worlds that once stood proud under the banner of the Council lowered their flags without firing a shot. It wasn't because they were weak. It was because they understood. They were facing a power born not from comfort, but from pain. They were facing a people who had spent a century in silence, shaping their fury into steel. The Council tried to stand tall, but the fear had already broken them from within. Some leaders fled to hidden outposts, hoping the Terrans would ignore them. Others begged for secret negotiations, but no answer ever came. The Terrans didn't send diplomats. They didn't need to. Their warships were their answer. Their silence was their voice. Every move they made carried the weight of a promise carved long ago in the dark. Over the central core, where the Council's greatest fleets waited, the stars shifted as the Terran Armada finally arrived. It was not an invasion like the galaxy was used to. There were no battle cries, no glorious speeches, no desperate charges. Just a wave of black ships sliding out of the void, their formation flawless, their engines glowing like cold embers. The defenders aimed every weapon they had, but their hands shook. Everyone on those bridges knew no amount of firepower could erase the guilt of a century. From orbit, entire cities stared upward as the night sky vanished behind Terran hulls. The people who once believed the stories of humanity's extinction now whispered in terror, asking why the Council lied. On the streets, some shouted for resistance, but no one moved. Fear was not forced upon them. It grew inside them like roots, planted years ago when the Council chose silence over mercy. Inside the Terran flagship, the commander stood at the center of the bridge, surrounded by officers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Their eyes burned, not with hatred, but with cold focus. They were not here for revenge born of chaos. They were here for something sharper, something heavier, justice. This was not a fleet seeking conquest. This was a reckoning. The Council finally sent a last desperate message. It was not a command or threat, just a plea. A broken voice begging for mercy they had never given. The reply came not in words but in movement. The Terran fleet spread its formation across the core like a shadow swallowing the sun. Entire defense lines powered down before the first shot was fired. The galaxy didn't need a war to understand what had already been decided. In that silence, a new banner rose, not over one world, but over all of them. Humanity didn't march with flags or songs. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to reshape the order of the stars. The Council's rule was over, not because they were defeated in battle, but because their lies could no longer stand against the truth. From the void they had been exiled to, humanity returned as something the galaxy could never again ignore. They were no longer the victims of betrayal. They were the storm that followed it. As the last Council fleets powered down and the stars fell silent, a new era began. The era of the Terran shadow. And in the cold darkness of space, the galaxy finally understood what it abandons will one day return. And when it does, the void remembers everything.